start a new year, or I guess we have started it already. And who knows what this new year is going to bring for us as a group and for you individually. I want to read a short passage of Scripture to you. This is a passage we would normally read around Easter time, but it's a passage I want to call your attention to as we begin a new year. This is from Mark's Gospel, chapter 14, verses 12 through 16. On the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the day for sacrificing the Paschal Lamb, Jesus' disciples asked him, "Where do you want us to go and make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" Then he sent two of his disciples, and he told them, "Go into the city, and you will meet a man carrying a jar of water. Follow him. Whatever house he enters into, say to the master of that house, 'The teacher asks, where is your guest chamber, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will himself show you a large upper room, furnished and ready. There, make preparation for us." So the disciples went off, and they came into the city, and they found everything just as he had told them. What's the first thing you think of when you hear that passage? Any questions occur to you when I was reading? First thing I thought of was, how did Jesus know?
How did he know, yeah.
He sends them to go into a city, and he says, when you get there, you're going to see a guy carrying a pot of water. How did Jesus know that they were going to see that? And the short answer is, we don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us. He just knew. Now, it's true that historians of that era and of that part of the world say that back then, this would have been unusual for a man to be carrying the water, because in that part of the world, in that time, this was the job that women did in the village. So Jesus may have known how unusual it was going to be to see this one man carrying water. But the Bible doesn't tell us. It's quite possible that that man himself didn't know why he was carrying water that day. It had been divinely prearranged. That much we know. And that's what this sermon is about. It's about divine prearrangements. You are entering into a year, and you have no idea what this year is going to bring for you. And I want you, rather than to be nervous and worried about that, I want you to rest in complete faith. Because while you don't know what the year is going to bring, God already does. Your year is already safe and secure in God's hands. God is going to lead you if you'll follow. God is going to lead you to where he wants you to be. I want to share some stuff from my own life on how God has done this in my life. When I was I guess I just finished my first year of seminary, and I was called to be the pastor of a little Baptist church in Picayune, Mississippi. This is where Lisa was born. And, I knew nothing about pastoring. What I didn't know about being a pastor could have filled the Encyclopedia Britannica. I had some ideas of what I thought it was going to be like. I envisioned hordes of people asking me questions about, the book of Leviticus, things like that. I just thought people were going to be consumed with, that type of information. That never happened, by the way. In fact, 41 years, I think, now into my ministry, no one has yet asked me a question from the book of Leviticus. What did happen, the first Sunday I went there, it was my first day as the pastor of this little church. I walked into my office, and there was a 12-year-old girl sitting on my desk. Not in the chair, on my desk. And in time I came to know this young girl, know her better, and Without going into a lot of detail, this was a girl who had suffered horrendous abuse in her family and who needed a lot of help. So the first thing I really started doing in this church was helping this young girl. Now, in time, more and more people started coming to my office. And what they needed was help too, with their families or personal help. And I realized that though my heart, I was willing to help, I realized I needed more training than I had. Back then, you could go through seminary. As I recall, there was only one counseling course that you were required to take. There were a lot of electives. They had a department of psychology and counseling, but you only had to take one course in your seminary degree. But I started taking with all of my electives. I took every course on counseling, psychology, family ministry, everything I could take, just to be better equipped to deal with the problems in that one church. When I left there, after I finished seminary, I left to go to a church in Mount Hermon, Louisiana. And this is where Jesse was born. Well, not in Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon was so small it didn't have a hospital. But the next town over had a hospital, and Jesse was born there. So this, what I had started out doing just as to meet a need, became my passion in ministry. And so I continued to do that, but also by then I had a fair amount of training in the field. And so the local Baptist Association there asked me if I would be there. An association that's kind of like a diocese, kind of a group of churches in a given area, and they asked me if I would be the family ministries director for that, that association. It was an unpaid position. I was still pastoring the church, but I did that. And in the fulfillment of that ministry, I taught some courses, conferences and the like for local pastors and church leaders, etc. One of the guys who came to one of my conferences once, his name was Ray Wells. He was the director of family ministry for the Louisiana Baptist Convention. Now, his was a full-time position. And I got an invitation from him to do a little more of that type of ministry. And so before long, I was teaching family conferences for Baptist church leaders all around South Louisiana. Now, during this time, Mary and I had begun to sense a call to go as missionaries overseas to Argentina. We prayed about that for a long time, wrestled with that decision, but finally came to that sense of peace that this is where God was leading us. But now, what I thought of as what missionaries do, I knew, for example, that Southern Baptists had over 5,000 missionaries at the time that we were supporting full-time. You know how many of them were doing full-time family ministry? One. So I knew that's not what I was going to be doing if we went overseas as missionaries, and yet that's where my heart was in ministry. So you don't always know why God's leading you to do something, but if you have a sense that God's leading you, then do it. Because you don't know, but God does. And so we said yes, and we prepared to go overseas. The week before we were to leave to go to Argentina, literally, the week before, I got a phone call. It was from Ray Wells, the family ministry director for the Louisiana Baptist Convention, offering me a job doing family ministry full time. It broke my heart to say no. But I told him, gosh, I wish you had called with this earlier, but we've already committed ourselves to go overseas. I have no idea what I'm going to be doing as a missionary in Argentina. I know it won't be family ministry. What you're offering me to do now is what I would love to do, but we can't because we've already given our word, and this is where we think God is leading us. And so we went overseas to Argentina. My first assignment there in Argentina, I was what they call an area missionary. And my area was the city of Buenos Aires. And so I was given a list of 75 Baptist churches. And they said, this is your field. And a lot of these churches don't know of some of the help that we can give them. We can help them develop their Sunday school. We can help them develop training and discipleship. We can help them develop stewardship, about like money and resources and things like that. We can help them if they need to build buildings. You're our guy. You go out there, start visiting these churches and tell them all of the things that are available that we can help them with. So I got my list. Now look, this was long before the internet, MapQuest, Google Maps. They didn't even have Thomas Guide over there. And the cities in Argentina, it's maddening, but the streets are not laid out in sequence numerically. So if you're driving down the street and you've got like 4700, and you're expecting the next house is like 4702 and 47, it doesn't work like that. They go by which house got built first. That's the one that gets the number. So you can have 4700 here and the next house might be 4910. And down the road 3 blocks may be 4702, So it was a chore just trying to find all these churches. But I went and I would go and I say, hi, I'm the new missionary in the area. All of this was in Spanish, and I'd only been speaking Spanish a year at the time, and so that was a challenge. But as I would go and say, look, we have all of these things we can help you with. How can we help you? Every place I went, they would say to me, look, that's all great. That's good, but you know where we really need your help? With our families. Our families are struggling. Our families are hurting. We've got couples who are thinking about divorce. We've got families whose kids are on drugs, or they're running around with gangs, or all the problems that you can imagine that exist. They exist everywhere. And they said that's what we really need help with. And the first few times that happened, I thought, well, that's interesting. But it happened every place I went to. Everyone. It was like someone had recorded this message for them and given it to them. They all said the same thing. That's all great, what you're telling us you can do for us. But you know where we really need help? And I got to where I would say, families? And they would say, yeah, we need help with our families. So I go back to the mission president and I tell him, look, we're missing the boat here. We're way off. We've come here with what we think these churches need, and we're telling them this is what you can do for you, and we're not listening to them. Because every place I go, what they're telling me is, we don't need help with our Sunday school, we need help with our families. We didn't have any material to help with families. And so the mission president, he's with the Lord now for many, many years. His name is Marion Lineberger, gentle, sweet, sweet soul, who was a missionary for decades in Argentina. He said, well, look, I'll tell you what, don't you have some training in this? Didn't you do some of your master's level work in that? And I said, yeah. And he said, you write it in Spanish, which you've been speaking for a year. You write this material. And you start going around, and every time a church says, we need help with our family, you ask them what the problem is, and when they tell you, you write material for that, and you go teach it to them. That's what I started doing. And of course my Spanish wasn't perfect, still isn't. But when you're trying to help people, people will be wonderfully sweet and receptive. And they knew I was there to help, and if my Spanish didn't come out right, I remember once confusing the word sin and fish. And that got a big laugh from the group when I was trying to say sin and I said fish instead. And they just said, no, you say it like this. Because finally, here was somebody who wanted to help them. Now, we had a Baptist Bible Institute there in the area close to where we lived, a town or two over. And they asked me if I would come and start teaching part-time at that institute. to help not just the churches, but to start training the pastors so they could help their own congregation. And I did that for a while. By the end of our first term, I had been asked to teach at the big seminary in Buenos Aires. Baptists have, we built your money built, well, maybe not your money, that was built long before, but in the early 1900s, but Southern Baptists built the largest Protestant seminary in South America. It's in the city of Buenos Aires. They asked me if I would come and teach counseling there to the pastors, and also serve as the counselor for the students of the seminary. Now, do you see what God did? I hung up on Ray Wells 4 years before saying, this breaks my heart to say no, because I know I will never be doing family ministry as a missionary. I just know God wants us to go to Argentina as a missionary. I thought I was turning my back on that, saying no to that, when in fact God was saying, no, no, no. That's not where this is going at all. You're going to do more family ministry there than you would ever have done here. See, I didn't know that. I just knew that God was saying, go do this. Well, by the end of our first term, end of our first 4 years, the director, Southern Baptist Missionary Director, Foreign Mission Board, for all of South America, flew down to Argentina to meet with us. And he said, I would like you in your second term, you're about to go on furlough, I want you to do two things. I want you to take what they call a study furlough. Now, most missionaries, when they come back on furlough for a year, they just go around and promote missions, try to raise money in that. And he said, I don't want you to do that. I want you to do a study furlough. I want you to go do graduate study in psychology and counseling. And when you come back, I want you to work full-time in family ministry. You see what God was doing? And so that's what we did. We came in, went back to New Orleans to seminary, and I started doing my graduate work there. As part of that, I did a year-long clinical internship at a state hospital. It's what they used to call a mental hospital. They don't use that terminology now. And I was training there with students from Tulane Medical School who were specializing in psychiatry, LSU Medical School, which is in New Orleans. And so I started doing that clinical work too, just to be better prepared. One of the, you do, what they call rotations. You spend a few months in each of the different departments. And the one department that everybody dreaded, it was headed up by a psychologist from Johns Hopkins. She was there for several years in that hospital doing research in behavior therapy with schizophrenics. Everybody in our school dreaded going there because she was a very unpleasant woman. She was an atheist. She did not like Christians. She didn't like the students that our department sent to her. But this woman and I got along great. She was an odd duck, I will admit that, but we got along fine. At the end of my rotation with her, which was 3 months, which I was so thankful it was over, the director of our department comes up to me and he says, Dr. Behringer has requested that you do another rotation with her. And I said, not a chance. Not a chance. And he said, well, look, I'm going to ask you this as a favor, because hers is the most prestigious department in the hospital, and ours was probably the least prestigious. And he said, she has never before asked for one of our students to do a second rotation with her. And if you do this, it would help us. It would give us a little more credence and prestige, and would help this relationship with her. So begrudgingly, I said yes, and I ended up doing 2 rotations. 6 months of my year was spent in her department. Which it wasn't just that she was an unpleasant person. I was not interested in behavior modification or in working with schizophrenia. None of that was going to be related to my work on the mission field. But here's what happened. She had a lot of weight in that hospital. You know, she was an important person. About 3 weeks before I was set to finish my year, the director of our department comes up to me and says, look, this is hush-hush, but I have taken another job. I'm going to be head of a hospital in the state of Washington. I need to find a replacement for me. I would like to recommend you. And more importantly, Dr. Behringer wants you. Well, that would have been a great job. It would have been just staying there in that hospital. It would have meant saying no to going back to Argentina. But I thought, boy, you know, I do like this kind of thing, and even though it's not my ministry and it's not my calling, I could do great work here. And I'm telling you this story to confess to you that this path that God has moved me along, sometimes I have gotten in my own way, or I've gotten in God's way. There have been missteps along the way, all of them of my own doing. I said, give me a day to think about it. I went back the next day and said, yeah, I'm gonna take it. I'll take this job. And so it was announced. I got my little thing. And for 2 weeks, I was the most miserable human being on the planet. Because I knew as good as this was and as important as this was not what God had called me to do. This is not the path God was moving me on. So with great embarrassment, after 2 weeks, I had to go into his office and say, I can't do it. This is great, but this is not what God called me to do. One thing that helped, and Mary, you might remember this, the guy who had become, you know the guy I told you about who had flown to Argentina before we left, and he said, I want you to, he had retired. His replacement, just by chance, was in New Orleans for some kind of a conference. They were living in South America, but he was in New Orleans for a conference, and just by chance, he thought, let me go visit Roger and Mary while I'm here. I know they're on furlough in New Orleans. So he came, and he visited with us, and I told him, his name was Ted Stanton, and I told him, Ted, and this was during that little 2-week window, I said, Ted, I have taken this job to be the director of this program for the hospital. I won't be going back to Argentina. And Ted said something, it was so profound, but so simple, okay? It's not going to seem profound to you when I say it, but it was exactly what I needed to hear. He thought about it. He was a great guy. He thought about it for a little while and he said, well, Roger, just because somebody offers you a job doesn't mean you have to take it. That's true. Hadn't thought about that, but that's true. And that helped us make that decision to say no to that. And we went back to Argentina. I worked that. We were only back a year. We had an illness in the family that necessitated coming back. Easiest decision I've ever made. You know, when the health of your children is involved, you have great clarity, right, on what you need to do. But that year we went back was the best year we had in Argentina. I taught at the seminary. I was the counselor for the students there. I developed, while we were on furlough, I developed a program for using group counseling. See, and you need to know this, that in South America, Argentina, Baptists are viewed the same way we view, let's say, Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons, but even lower, actually. There's great suspicion about, you know, Baptists. They don't really know who we are. They think we're weird. Most of the Baptist churches there are in neighborhoods where the people won't step foot in a Baptist church. But as I would go visit with the pastors, they would say to me, you know, we go out, we visit people, they invite them to come to our church. They won't step foot in the door on Sunday, but they will come by during the week and say, is there a pastor here who can help us? Can I talk to somebody? They had personal problems too. So I told the guys, let me train you how to gather a group that will meet during the week. They don't have to come on Sundays. We'll meet during the week and you will minister to them whatever their needs are. You can share the gospel with them during that time, but it will all be done in the context of the group, not on Sundays. And I trained 24 pastors in that 1 year on how to do that. One of them, by the way, now is a licensed psychologist living in Miami, or Florida, in Sarasota, doing that very type of ministry. We even had a recommendation once from a voodoo priest. We would always ask people when they would come to the group, how did you hear about us? Why are you here? And one guy said, well, you know, my wife and I were going through a divorce and I really hate that woman. And I went to see the voodoo priest to see if he could put a curse on her. And the guy said, well, you know, I don't really do that kind of thing. I try to do more, you know, kind of good stuff. But there's a Baptist church down there, and I heard they help families at that church. You should go see them. And that's how that guy came to our group. That one group, the first group we started with, the pilot group, 17 people came to faith in Christ in that 1 year through that one group. So you see, God was moving all along, moving us where he wanted us to be. Now, as I said, we came back, had an illness. We didn't know where we were going to relocate. The Foreign Mission Board said there is a position in Buffalo, New York. It's the Director of Community Ministries for the western part of the state of New York. We think you'd be perfect for it. So I did a lot of interviews with them all over the phone. They knew my work record and all that, so that hurdle was already over. And they said, we would like to recommend you for this position. And I said, okay. So this is New York, Buffalo. And they said, Monday night we're going to meet to vote on you. And so Mary and I waited to see what the vote would be, their group, you know. And they called me on Tuesday and said there was a blizzard last night. Nobody could leave their houses. So no meeting, we're going to meet next Monday. And I said, no worries. Monday came, Tuesday morning they called me. There was another blizzard. It hit Monday night, nobody could leave their house. We said, no worries. They said, we're going to meet next Monday. Guess what happened that Monday? Blizzard. When they called back on Tuesday and said there was another, I told Mary, I think this is a sign. We are not supposed to go to Buffalo. We came here to California. I was at First Bilingual for a while. Worked with the California Southern Baptist Convention. My area was Los Angeles, but more than that, it had Long Beach and Western LA and the San Fernando Valley, Ventura County. It was a nightmare, a lot of traveling. But one of the things that happened in my work was one day I got a call from a man named Chester Hale. And Chester said, hi, I'm from First Baptist Church of Baldwin Park. We are going through a terrible problem here. And he said, we called the local association and asked if they could help us. And they had spoken with Ike Stiles, who long since with the Lord now. But I told them, you know, we've got a guy who lives right here in Los Angeles. He has a lot of training in mediation, problem, you know, conflict solving, all of that. You should call him. And so Chester called me and I came out. And you old timers, you know the problem I'm talking about. And I met with that guy, nothing came of it, you know. Met with most of the people involved, nothing came of it, and I didn't think anything more about it other than just, well, that didn't work, you know, that didn't solve anything. But during that next year, illness struck our family again, this time me. I had severe symptoms of MS, was doing really, I knew I could not continue the job that I had. was doing. All that driving, I couldn't do it. I could barely walk, much less drive. No, this is a year later, and I get another phone call. And it's from Chester Hale again. And he says, I don't know if you remember me, and I did. And he said, you know, that problem we had, it's over now, the guy's gone. But we don't have a pastor, and we remember you from when you, see how God was moving? We remember you from when you were here and when you tried to help us. We were wanting to know if you were interested in being our pastor. God's timing. God's timing. And here I am, 19 years later. So you don't have to figure the future out. God already has. You just have to follow him. We sang the first stanza of that song, He Leadeth Me, a little while ago. In 1863, a Baptist preacher named Joseph Gilmore was invited to preach at the First Baptist Church of Philadelphia. Now, this was during the height of the Civil War. The nation was torn apart, feeling abandoned by God. And he had decided to preach that night from Psalm 23. And as he was preaching through that psalm, he came to that line, He leadeth me beside the still waters. I couldn't stop thinking about that. Even after the sermon was over and they had been invited to eat in the home of one of the church deacons, and they went there. And as they were sitting there, he kept thinking about that line, He leadeth me. So he took his sermon notes and he flipped it over to the blank side of the page, and he jotted down a few thoughts. He leadeth me, O blessed thought, O words with heavenly comfort fraught. Where'er I go, where'er I be, still 'tis God's hand that leadeth me. And he wrote down some other words, showed them to his wife later. She liked it, and she turned them into a magazine in Philadelphia at the time. It's called The Watchman and the Reflector. And they thought it was good enough to publish as a poem, and so for them that was the end of it. Unbeknownst to them, a musician saw that magazine, saw that poem, and liked it so much he set it to music. His name was William Bradbury. He set it to music. These two people didn't know each other, and Gilmore didn't know what Bradbury had done. 3 years later, Joseph Gilmore was invited to the Second Baptist Church of Rochester, New York, what we call in view of a call. In other words, they were going to vote on him to be their new pastor. He got there a little early that day, and he sat down in the pew. Now, things were much different then, with no mass communication. He wondered, what kind of hymns do the Baptists in New York sing? And he saw their hymnal there in the pew. And so he picked up that hymnal, and he let it fall open just at random. And it was his poem, set to music. He leadeth me, O blessed thought. That's such a profound sentence, isn't it? The idea behind it. But it's so true. God leads us step by step by step to the place where he wants to be. And that's why we don't need to be filled with anxiety about the future, because while we don't know what it brings, God already does. And he is already leading you to where he wants you to be. Now, what do you have to do? There is something that you have to do. You remember in the passage we read earlier, it's in verse 16. Jesus told the disciples to go to the house. And what did they do? They went. And what did they find when they got there? Exactly. Mark says they found it exactly as he had told them, and it was already prepared. That's what you have to do. You have to believe Jesus and obey Jesus. That's kind of Christianity in a nutshell, isn't it? Believe Jesus and obey Jesus. Follow the steps where he leads you. You'll find when you get there, it has already been prepared. Let's pray. Lord, thank you that our futures are more important to you than they are to us. And that you love us as a father loves his children. And that you desire for us the very best, which is always found inside of your will for our lives. Help us to believe you without wavering. Help us to obey you, that you might lead each of us to that place where you want us to be. We pray this in Jesus' name.